Now we're going to talk about shifting the aggregate demand curve. Shown on the graph here, it indicates an increase in the aggregate demand shown as a shift with an arrow to the right from AD1 to AD2. I've thrown an aggregate supply, although this will be talked about in a later lesson. But the main thing to focus on is we have an increase in aggregate demand, and therefore we have increased the total quantity of output, the quantity of goods and services that are demanded by the people in an economy. Just as in individual and market demands, aggregate demand shifts the same ways. Increase aggregate demand to the right, shown on the graph on the left. Decrease aggregate demand to the left, shown on the graph on the right. So an increase in aggregate demand to the right, a decrease in aggregate demand going to the left. The factors affecting a shift in aggregate demand, one of which is consumption or changes in consumption, which an event that makes consumers spend more at a given price level will shift the AD demand curve to the right, such as tax cuts, which put more money in the pocket of consumers, which means they're willing and able to buy more, probably, and a stock market boom, which also would give people more money buys more goods and services, increased aggregate demand to the right. Events that may cause a shift to the left would be just the opposite. A tax increase gives people much less money to buy with, or a stock market decline gives people less money to buy goods and services with as well, thus decreasing aggregate demand, shifting it to the left. Shifts arising from investment, same kind of setup, increasing to the right would mean optimism about the future and a decrease in interest rates. If a business is optimistic about the future, they're going to go ahead and invest in capital goods, which then will make them more productive in the future. On the other hand, if aggregate demand is decreased because of pessimism about the future, businesses are going to be less likely to actually want to build more capital goods and be more productive in the future because they're going to want to save and get ready for what could be a long recession or a long period of time where they might not make as much money as before. In regards to interest rates, if interest rates decrease, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right, showing an increase because if the interest rates go down, people are more likely to borrow money and build. From a consumer standpoint, what might be more relevant to us is a decrease in interest rates means it's cheaper to buy a mortgage or cheaper to buy a house. If it's cheaper, I'm more likely to buy a house, which means I can invest, get in a low interest rate, buys me a house. For the business, that might mean more capital goods, another factory, a larger facility, whatever the case may be. A decrease in interest rates means I can buy more. And vice versa, an increase in interest rates would be shown with a shift of the curve to the left. For government purchases, pretty much shift to the right if the government decides to spend more money on defense and highways or whatever else they're going to spend their money on. And a decrease in government purchases would shift the aggregate demand to the left, which would be any sort of spending cuts that they might begin. Net exports, for the most part, pretty straightforward. Increase in aggregate demand to the right if there's an economic boom overseas, which means that overseas we're able to sell more products because more products are being demanded overseas by whichever country or countries are experiencing an economic boom, meaning they can buy more at each given price level, which means they're probably going to demand more of our goods. Or an economic recession overseas would mean that they're all buying less, that all of the people, maybe around the world or in certain countries, are buying less products overall, which probably also include American-made products. So an economic recession overseas would decrease aggregate demand to the left because they're just buying less goods and services overall, and chances are then they're also buying less American goods as well. Just as in Unit 2 when we dealt with individual and market demands, one problem that a lot of students have is knowing the difference between a movement along the aggregate demand curve versus an aggregate demand curve shift. If aggregate demand shifts, it's because of one of the factors stated previously. If it's a movement along the curve, meaning we do not make a new curve, we just move along the curve, it's only when the price level changes. Now, when we change the price level, a different quantity of goods and services will be demanded. However, we do not need to show a shift to indicate that change. So it's a movement along the curve. The key is the change of the price level would indicate a movement along the curve. This is what a correctly labeled curve for a change in price level on the aggregate demand curve would be reflected as. We start at P, Y, and a decrease in the price level going from P to P2 indicates an increase in the quantity of goods and services demanded. So we started at P, Y, decrease in price level, P2, Y2, and we can show through a movement along the aggregate demand curve that yes, people have bought more quantity of goods and services demanded, but we didn't have to shift the curve to show that. This is only reflected in a change in price level when we move along the aggregate demand curve. In summary, movement along versus an aggregate demand shift. When the price level stays the same, the problem stem doesn't say anything about price level, aggregate demand is going to change if that's in fact the question. The key is that the price level stays the same if we're going to have an aggregate demand shift. If the problem stem says price level decreases or price level increases or something very similar, then you start thinking to yourself, I need to be looking at a movement along the aggregate demand curve, not shifting the curve, but I'm still going to show that it's either an increase or decrease in the quantity of goods and the quantity of output along the aggregate demand curve.